Welcome back to Nigeria, the road to 2019. I'm Charles Anagoru. Now this week, aid agencies based in Nigeria released a report saying that armed rebel groups have killed more than 100 soldiers in the northeast over the past 3 weeks and have forced thousands of civilians to flee their homes, many of them to neighbouring Cameroon and Chad. They say most of the attacks have been carried out by a faction of the Boko Haram militant group, which is allied to Islamic State. Such violence has apparently intensified in the run-up to Nigeria's presidential election, which is due to be held in about 3 weeks from now. Last week, the militants reportedly overran the town of Ran in the northeastern state of Borno. Well, for more on this, let's speak now to the international security analyst, David Otto. Thank you very much indeed, David, for joining us and for your patience there, because we had these stories breaking all around Nigeria, these political stories. First of all, tell us about these groups that are responsible for the recent violence in Borno State, which is the epicenter of this insurgency.
Of course, this is no news. The Boko Haram Islamic State faction, which is called Al-Barnawi, has been responsible for these attacks. What they've been doing in the past 2 months or so, when they received a lot of personnel and support from some of the foreign fighter returnees from the Islamic State, is to carry out massive attacks in local government areas in Borno and recently in Yobe. Effectively, what they've been doing is putting the military on a constant defensive, and this has been made worse because we believe that this was a period of relocation. Most of these individuals who have now been displaced and made as refugees in neighbouring Cameroon and Niger and Chad, these are people who have been, in IDP camps before, and they've been relocated to their various local government areas, in the guarantee that the military will protect them. But what we've seen with the ISWAP faction is that they've been attacking military strongholds frequently. Even as early as yesterday, there was an attack in Gaidam. Of course, the military managed to repel, but at a loss. So what we see is a constant tactics by the Islamic State of West African province to not hold territory, but to make it very uncomfortable for the military to protect the people by keeping them on the defensive.
So, David, what is the aim of this latest upsurge in violence? I mean, are the militants trying to disrupt the elections, in addition, of course, to attacking military bases and taking weapons and health supplies?
I think one of the reasons why we see these attacks, of course, the election period is a period which diverts the attention of the political elites. A lot of them would be focusing on making speeches, to gain support from the voters. There's going to be a very little effort put towards actually making things happen on ground. But I think it's rather coincidental, because the Islamic State of West African province is now on the upsurge. I mean, not only because there are reports that they are actually working with the Boko Haram Jihadist faction, which came as a result of an advice by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, popularly known as Hakim. They advised the Islamic State of West African province and the Shekau faction to work in tandem, even though they have disagreement in terms of how they carry out their operations. So I think this is rather a coincidence, in the sense that these groups are now working, collaborating strategically, but also because a lot of the political elites that are supposed to be doing their job are focused on the election. But mind you, Boko Haram has been there for the past 10 years actively carrying out attacks. So if we've had elections, in 2015 there was one election, they were still there, they are still there now. So it doesn't really I can't really say that it's because of the election, but the election factor may be at the back of their minds, because they might be thinking the next guy who wins, should be able to, kind of find a way, a proper diagnosis of, how to carry out an approach, a solution approach to the current problem.
Well, I mean, I'm just wondering, David, if it is perhaps more than a coincidence, because, I mean, as we mentioned, the elections are less than a month away, and we've heard reports that people have been asked by militants in the northeast to destroy their permanent voter cards that they need to vote. I mean, have you heard any reports to that effect? Because, of course, part of the ideology, as we understand it, of these groups is against what they see as Western-style democracy.
Yes, the idea of destroying voters' registration cards, would go in tandem to destroying identification cards and passports. Of course, the Islamic State of West African Province, as much as the Shekau faction, they've always talked about not engaging in any electoral, processes, because that somehow guarantees the existence of what they refer to as a Western-backed regime, or a Western-style regime, you may call it. So I don't think this is kind of strange. I mean, this is their modus operandi. The election period is just a time for them to actually gain more space, so to speak. That a lot of electoral politicians would be talking about using some of these tactics to say, well, I'm going to solve the Boko Haram crisis, so you can vote me and all that. Boko Haram understands this because they're very, very clever in that way. So, I think it's all an advantage for them, rather. Tactics that helps them in driving forward the ideology of Western education is haram.
I think you're absolutely right, because of course President Buhari campaigned on security and promised to restore security back in 2015. And I'm just wondering what sort of impact, I mean, these attacks are likely to have on the elections, both in terms of where they're likely to hold, if they will be held in many parts of places like Borno State, for instance.
First of all, yes, President Buhari, campaigned on the backdrop that he would defeat Boko Haram, and of course, the evidence is that even though he's made so many attempts to bring down the capacity of the group, the truth is that nobody really knows the capacity of Boko Haram, so you can't really measure how much damage you've done. Yes, Buhari has said several times that Boko Haram has been technically defeated. What that means is a matter of interpretation. But as we say, when Goodluck Jonathan, who was a former president, had attempted in some way to cancel the election or postpone it on the basis that Boko Haram was causing havoc in the northeast, the then candidate, President Buhari, who is the current president, had argued strongly that Boko Haram should not be a reason why elections should be cancelled or postponed. So I don't think that is going to happen. Any other candidate would use the same tactics, to say, well, if the elections were held in 2015, they might as well, hold in February, despite the insecurity. So that is not going to go down well, within, the electoral candidates. The elections will take place. How that affects, people voting is a matter of the electoral committee to make that decision. But again, it would be disenfranchising a lot of people, especially those who have moved to these local government areas, not to be able to exercise their voting rights because the military that has been deployed, is unable to protect them, and they themselves are under constant attack. So the dynamics are quite rough, and it is indeed going to affect the outcome of the election.
Well, you have a point there. You've kept an eye on international security with relation to Nigeria, not just in Nigeria, but also the other sort of regions, the other countries around Nigeria that are equally affected by the Boko Haram insurgency. But of course, the elections are taking place here in Nigeria. What's the biggest issue in your assessment in these elections? Is it security, or is it the economy, or is it the very high levels of unemployment, of all of them sort of wrapped into one?
What I think is, with insecurity, you wouldn't be able to guarantee any economic progress. Of course, unemployment would rise in an environment where there is insecurity. The political will also be, heavily shaken in situations where, you can't guarantee the security of individuals in the state. So having security is a must, within Nigeria, but across the region. Of course, recent attacks have been carried out by groups that are loyal to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, groups that are loyal to all these powerful factions. I mean, we've seen attacks being carried out not just in Cameroon, but also in Chad and Mali. So the general situation is almost the same in the sense that without security, there is not much that a government can achieve economically, because you can't actually guarantee any economic progress. You won't attract investors in a country, for example, where there are security concerns. I mean, take, for example, the recent attack that was carried out in Kenya by Al-Shabaab. That will be damaging to the Kenyan economy for a country that relies a lot on tourism. So it is the same effect. And whenever people or investors want to come to these countries to improve on the economy, to improve on the issues of unemployment, and even to help in the political stability, the first question is, how secure is the country? That's the key, Charles.
On that note, David, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us there. David Otto is, of course, the international security analyst. That's it for this edition of Nigeria, the Road to 2019. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and, of course, London for today, bye-bye and thank you for watching.